Right then, welcome to day 3 of JavaScript testing for beginners. Today we're going to talk about asynchronous testing. We're going to talk about testing callback functions, writing asynchronous tests, some gotchas that you need to know about. We'll talk about Mocha's done function, which is how you write your asynchronous tests and how you get them to call a callback. And we're going to talk a little bit about testing promises. Right, so let's get started. I've created 2 new files, day3.js and day3test.js. Same thing that we did yesterday. We've got a new function which does nothing, but it has a callback which we're going to call. And then we're going to have our test here. So first off, we're going to write a test to test that we get the value we want from our callback function. So we're going to do should return expected value from callback. Now how we're going to call this, we're going to go day 3, and then we're going to call a callback function. So we've got some callback function that we're going to pass through. I'm using ES6, so I'm just using an arrow function. So what inside my function, I want to know that the value returned there, so we say return data. We want expect, we're going to use chai again, and our expectation, we do expect returned data to equal hello. So we're going to pass back for our callback function, we're going to pass back hello when the callback's called. Okay, let's try running our tests. We'll run mocha again with require Babel register. Now it's running the test from yesterday. One thing we can do, top tip, we can just run the tests we want to run and we can isolate those from the tests that we wrote yesterday. So instead of writing mocha with require Babel register, we can add test/day3.test.js and just test the tests for day 3. Now funny things happen at the moment. It looks like the tests have passed. Obviously they haven't, we haven't written any code yet. But this is one thing we're going to need to watch out for. By default, Mocha is going to assume that the tests are synchronous. So when this function ends, it assumes the test has passed. It's obviously not. So we need to tell Mocha that we have finished an asynchronous function. So what we're going to do is we're going to pass the done callback. So when you pass done through here, you need to call it. Okay, so if we don't call it, we'll just run that without calling it. You can see the test runs, it waits, but then it times out. So Mocha has a default timeout. At the moment, it's 2 seconds. And if it exceeds 2 seconds, it assumes that the test hasn't finished and isn't working. So we need to make sure that we call our done function here. So we say, once we get our callback with our data, we check what the data is, and then we call done. So let's run the test again. Again, it's timed out because our callback's never been called, so we're never getting inside this function, so we're never calling done. So let's have a look at our code then and see what we can do. We can make it work. So let's do something like a callback that's called after a timeout. So we do set timeout, which calls a function, which calls our callback function with hello, and we're going to call that after 1 second. Let's try that now. Great stuff. So our tests run here, and we've returned the data hello here, as we expect in our test. If we check for hello 2, we'll see that it hasn't worked because the expectation wants hello. So as long as we've got hello, we're all good. But there's one major thing to look at in the test here. Now Mocha will tell you how long tests take if they're quite long. Here it says 1006 milliseconds. So it's taken just over a second to run the test. Now for unit tests, you probably don't want your test to be running slowly. In tomorrow's lesson, I'm going to tell you a little bit how we can fix this. But for now, we'll leave it as is. We don't want lots of slow tests. The more tests you write, obviously, if each test takes a second, it's going to start slowing you down. Okay, so we've tested an asynchronous function with a callback. But how about testing promises? Let's try that out. So we're going to write another test. Should return expected value from promise with done. So we're going to use the done function again. We need to pass that through. That's a callback which we need to call to tell Mocha that we've finished. We'll now assume that if we don't pass a callback function through, it'll return as a promise. Okay. So rather than doing as we did before, some callback function here, what we'll do is we'll just call day 3, and then it'll return a promise, which is then, and that'll return as a data. So returned data And then we can do our expectation again in here. Expect returned data to equal hello. And then, as we did earlier, we need to make sure that we call our callback function from Mocha to tell it that the code is done. Okay, so at the moment this is not going to work. Okay, see, there's no then because we're not actually returning a promise. So we always assume it's a set timeout. So we say if callback, then we'll do that. Okay, so let's return a promise here. We'll just do a promise.resolve and we'll resolve with hello. So that's a promise that resolves with hello. If we run the test now, you'll see, great, it's worked. So we've got our promise. We're waiting until the data has been returned from the promise with our then. Then we just call the done function. However, with Mocha, there's an easier way to do this. Mocha allows us to return a promise. So if you return a promise from a Mocha function, it then waits for that promise to resolve. And then when that resolves, that means the test passed. So let's try that. So it should return expected value from promise. So when we return promise here, we don't need to use the done function. All we need to do is return, and we'll do the same thing, day 3, dot then, return data, returned data even. And then we'll do our same expectation, returned data to equal hello. A few semicolons. There we go. Let's try running this test now. Great stuff, that works. So that's 2 different ways to test promises there with Mocha. So one thing to remember is that you have to return the promise. This is a big gotcha with asynchronous testing. It looks like it'll pass, but our expectation isn't actually called and the test just passes in the same way we said before. So if we add in a console.log to tell us when the expectation's called, you can see that it's actually run afterwards. So let's just run the test again and see. If we return the promise again, we can see the expectation and the console log is run before the expectation's called. So always remember to return the promise. And the same thing with calling the done function. Always check that you do call the done function within your test. That's all for today's lesson. Tomorrow, we'll learn how to speed up our asynchronous tests. We're going to install Async, which is a test double package. And we're going to use that. It has a fake timer. And we're going to do some time traveling to speed up our tests.